Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about a topic that I've already hit on in the previous video, and that is the discriminant. And if you don't remember, the discriminant is the part of the quadratic formula that's under the square root, the b squared minus 4ac, and I'm going to put is equal to d, which stands for discriminant. So that's the stuff, again, under the square root. Here's your formula, negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, here's what the discriminant does for you. What information does it provide? If your discriminant is a positive, it's greater than 0, and it's a perfect square, that means that your quadratic equation, and you can remember the plus or minus, if this is something we know the square root of, then we'll be able to combine these b's and whatever that is. You can be able to combine those like terms. So therefore, you'll have two answers, the plus answer and the minus answer, and they will both be rational answers. The other scenario, if it's positive, but you don't know the square root of it, what if b squared minus 4a is something like 13? Hey, I don't know the square root of 13. That's where you're going to have to leave it as negative b plus the square root of 13 and negative b minus the square root of 13. You can't combine those two like terms, or two unlike terms, but you'll still have two roots. However, the square root of 13 or some square root that you don't know, that will be two irrational answers. If your discriminant is 0, again, the square root of 0 is 0, and if you did plus 0 or minus 0, that's the same answer. So when d was equal to 0, you only had one answer, and that answer was going to be, again, a rational answer. And then your last scenario, what if your discriminant was a negative, the square root of negative? Hey, wait a minute, square root of negative, that was where we had imaginary. Square root of negative would yield imaginary answers. And those imaginary answers was the plus square root and the minus square root, so there would be two imaginary answers. So on this next one, we're just finding, we're not actually finding the roots. We're just finding our discriminant, and we're going to use that discriminant to tell how many roots we're going to have and what type. So first off, let's do b squared minus 4ac, our discriminant. B squared is 144 minus 4 times 2 times negative 13. Is a negative 104. So minus minus is a plus. That's going to be 248. And again, in my formula, that's the stuff under the radical. I don't know the square root of 248, but it is a positive value, so that means I'm going to have two roots, and those two roots are going to be irrational because, again, I don't know the square root of 248. Next one. B squared minus 4ac. B squared is 16 times 16, which is 256, minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 64, which is also equal to 256. So that gives you 0. Your discriminant, the stuff under your square root in your formula is 0. So going back and looking at the formula, if the stuff under the square root is 0, you'll have plus 0 and minus 0. That's the same answer. So anytime your discriminant is equal to 0, then you'll have one answer and only one answer, and that will be one real rational answer. The next one, let's move everything to the same side. That's negative 4x squared minus 10x plus 84 equals 0. You've got to do that first before you find your discriminant. B squared would be 100 minus 4 times negative 4 times 84. And that's going to be negative 1344. Minus minus is a plus, which gives you 1444. That's the stuff under the radical. Now the next question, we know we're going to have two answers because the square root of 1444 would give you two different answers, the plus and minus. However, is it rational or irrational? If we know the square root of 1444, it's going to be rational. If we don't know the square root of 1444, then that would create an irrational solution. Square root of 1444, if you check it, is 38. So therefore, it would be two rational answers. Something else it tells you, if you have two rational answers, this would have been factorable. A much easier way to have solved it. Next up, b squared minus 4ac. The b term is missing. So b squared will be 0 minus 4 times 3 times 24. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 24 is 288. So that gives you 0 minus 288, which is a negative 288. That's the stuff under the radical. So therefore, we're going to have two different solutions, and since it's the square root of a negative, that means those two solutions will be imaginary. So, next part says choosing the best method to solve. First off, graphing. Graphing can be used pretty much any time. However, if I'm going to graph, I'm going to use some sort of graphing software. So when should you use it? Only when graphing software, and this is different from the answer they gave, but this is what I feel like. Only when graphing software is available. Because this is hands down the worst method to solve it if you're having to graph it by hand. And this can be used sometimes, but I would say not. It would not be the best method every time. Factoring. Factoring can be used sometimes because sometimes you're not going to have a factorable quadratic. So therefore, it can be used sometimes when answers are rational. You're not going to be able to factor most of the time if you have irrational answers. So if your answers was like -2 and +3, when it's something factorable, that would be the best time to use that. Square roots can, again, only be used sometimes. The only time that you're going to be able to use a square root is when b is 0. And when you're missing that b term, then you can solve by square roots. Completing the square can always be used. However, the best time to use completing the square is when your a is 1. You don't have like 3x squared or 4x squared. And when your b, your middle term, is an even number. So therefore, you can take half of it and square it really easy. And the quadratic formula, again, can always be used. And so this, again, always be used. And the best time is when other methods fail. The quadratic formula is our go-to method. If we can't factor it, when completing the square, maybe a is 3 or b is a 7. When those other methods are going to be tough, that's the best time to use our quadratic formula. So in these next 4 equations, we're asked to pick the best method for these. Which method should we use? Equation A, B, C, and D. Now, find the discriminant of each and give the number of roots first is what it says. So let's do that. So our discriminant here, we'll find it on all 3. B squared minus 4AC would be 81 minus 4 times 1 times 4 times 1 times 21, which would be 84. So our discriminant is -3. So therefore, we will have 2 imaginary solutions here. Our second equation, b squared minus 4ac, we have no b term, so we have 0 minus 4 times -2 times 144, which is -1152. Minus minus is a plus, so 1152 is the stuff under the radical. And then you ask yourself, well, do we know the square root of 1152? We do not. So therefore, we will have 2 solutions, just like in the first one, and they will be irrational. In our third equation, b squared minus 4ac, you've got, here's b is 22, so 22 squared, or -22 squared is 484 minus 4 times 3 times 7 is going to be 84. Subtract that gives you 400. So therefore, since it's positive, we're going to have 2 solutions. Since we know the square root of 400, which is 20, those solutions will be rational. Anytime you have 2 rational solutions, this should be factorable. And then the final one, b squared is 36 minus 4 times 1 times -15. That is a -60. 36 plus 60 gives you 96, which tells us there's going to be 2 answers. I don't know the square root of 96, so those answers will be irrational. So let's find the best method for each of these. First off, the obvious one, I'm missing a b term here. So the square root is going to be best for that one. So let's actually solve it. That's going to be -2x squared plus 144 is equal to 0. To solve a quadratic equation by using square roots, first move the 144 over. Negative 2x squared equals negative 144. We then divide by negative 2. So that gives me x squared is equal to 72. To get rid of a square, we do plus and minus the square root. And I am going to split that, so that'll be x equals plus and minus the square root of 36 times the square root of 2, which will be a positive negative 6 root 2. So therefore, there's your two solutions. And you can see, as we predicted it with the discriminant, that is equation B there, we predicted it with the discriminant, those two solutions are both irrational. Now the next one, we always want to use whenever it's factorable, which means there's two rational answers. We always want to use factoring for those. So therefore, let's factor C. That's going to be 3x squared minus 22x plus 7 is equal to 0. So that's going to be a slip and slide factoring. X squared minus 22x plus 21 is equal to 0, two sets of parentheses. X and x, a negative, let's see, that's going to be a negative 21 and a negative 1. We move the 3, so now let's divide by it. And that's going to give you x minus 7 and a 3x minus 1 equals 0. So therefore, your two solutions set each of those equal to 0, and you're going to get x equals 7 and x equals 1/3. Okay, now the other two, we have now a and c. And we have left the quadratic formula and completing the square. Now, completing the square is not going to be fun here because I have an odd number. So this method, or this equation here, D, I'm going to use completing the square on. X squared plus 6x minus 15. And I believe that was equation D. And the reason I'm using completing the square is because I can very easily take half of that and square it. So step number 1, I'm going to take my 15 and I'm going to move it over. Half of 6 would be 3. Square it gives you 9. So let's add 9 to both sides. It is now factorable to a perfect square. That's going to be x plus 3, which was half of that, squared is equal to 24. Next step, to get rid of a square, we do plus and minus the square root of the other side. And that can be cleaned up. Square root of 4 times the square root of 6, which is 2 root 6. And the final step, you simply move the 3 over, and it becomes a negative 3. So negative 3 plus and minus 2 root 6. So that was very easy to use the completing the square on. And then our last one, the quadratic formula, we're going to use on this one because every other method failed or was not going to be easy. X squared minus 9x plus 21. X squared minus 9x plus 21 is equal to 0. And this is A. And let's go ahead and do this. We've already found the discriminant. So let's go ahead and use that. Our discriminant is the negative 3, so therefore the stuff under the square root is going to be negative 3. So we're going to split that into root 3 and the square root of negative 1, which will be I root 3. So now let's go ahead and plug the rest of our formula. Negative b plus and minus the square root stuff over 2 times a. So we pretty much got our formula done already because the discriminant was finished. And you can actually leave your answer like that, or you can split it and do 9/2 plus and minus. You could do the root 3 over 2 and put the I next to it if you would like to. Either way you want to leave your answers is fine.